My name is Noreen Gumbo. I work for Trocra, and it's my absolute pleasure to moderate this panel this afternoon. We have wonderful perspectives from right across the sector. We have on our Mentimeter, you're all adept now at Mentimeter, a question for you as we get started. And that is asking you whether your organization's policy and/or practice around partnership has changed since the Grand Bargain in 2016. So would you say there has been a change in your policy or practice around partnership since 2016? Answer agree or disagree, and let's see what comes. It's now 7 years since the World Humanitarian Summit, when the Grand Bargain, which is a bargain between donors and humanitarian agencies, was signed. And right at the beginning, it was acknowledged that a key pillar of that bargain had to be to shift more support and more funding to local and national organizations in order that humanitarian action would improve in efficiency and effectiveness. 5 years into the Grand Bargain, when the review was done, it was found that this really important pillar had not progressed as expected or as wished for. And so Grand Bargain 2.0 put in place a caucus, which was to look at why was this the case, what more needed to be done by donors, by intermediaries, the INGOs, the international non-governmental organizations, and by local and national actors in order to shift the dial. They came up with laid out the challenges around establishing fair and just partnerships. And they looked at, there are proposals now on the table for each of those 3 categories as to what needs to be done. Also in 2023, we have had the European Union's guide to equitable partnerships in the form of a guidance document launched at the European Humanitarian Forum in March. And we have had a policy from USAID on localization. It's titled Shift Power to Local Partners. But is the transformation that all of these efforts, policies, guidance, conferences, pledges, charters have put on the table, is it transforming for local agencies? Is there a shift in what type of partnerships national and local partners are enjoying or experiencing? This is the question that we will put to our panel this afternoon. Before we get to this great panel, we have some remarks from the imminent person of the Grand Bargain. But just before we turn him on, he couldn't be with us today, you can see that for those who have answered the question, and we only have 24 responses as far as I can see, the overwhelming majority do agree that partnerships have shifted, have changed either in policy or practice. But we might come back to that after we've listened to Jan. Perhaps while Jan is being brought up there on the screen, I will introduce you quickly to each of our panelists. First of all, we have Michael Mosselmans. Michael is the head of humanitarian division at Christian Aid and has been working on this issue for, well, since it started, I think, fair to say. Christina Bennett, the chief executive of the START network, and I think lots of her, everything was buzzing in her head during the last discussion, the last panel, with lots of themes that would be of interest to START network. We have Abdurahman Sharif, who is the director of partnership at Internews Europe. And we have Mary van Lieshout from Goal. She is the Director of External Affairs and the Deputy Chief Executive. So thank you to Jan. Next best thing to having him here in the room. I think he's given us a good overview of his perception of progress against the Grand Bargain. We're now going to move to our panel. We're going to start with Christina Bennett. I introduced Christina as the chief executive of the START network. But before Christina joined the START network, she worked with ODI, And she wrote a paper, or she headed up a team in 2016 that wrote a paper entitled Time to Let Go. It made three key proposals around how the system needed to change. So we're interested to hear, Christina, how you have been able to implement your proposals now that you have joined as Chief Executive of Start Network, and Start Network's ambition is to transform the humanitarian system.
Thanks very much, Noreen. Oh, good, this is on. Yep, so in 2016, I was at the Overseas Development Institute, which is a think tank in London, and drafted, using 5 years of ODI research, this paper called Time to Let Go, Remaking Humanitarian Action for the Modern Era. And we decided to do this paper because it was in time for the World Humanitarian Summit, and we thought it was a time to interrogate the assumptions, the sort of fundamental truths that had been part of our sector for more than a century, and use the opportunity of the summit to really dig into whether those were still relevant, because we recognized that we were falling short of the people that we were aiming to serve. So in that paper, I made 3 proposals. I'm going to read them to you now because I don't always remember what I said back then. But one was letting go of power and control in favor of taking on a more enabling role. And this was a message, all 3 of these messages are to the international humanitarian sector. So, we asked ourselves, what the starting point for our work should be not what do we have to give, but what can we do to support? So that was proposal 1. Proposal 2 was letting go of the perverse incentives that drive our institutions. And by that, I mean the incentives for growth, for visibility, that cause us to be in competition with one another, real destructive competition, when, as we know, the challenges of today's crises, and we just heard that in the first panel, require collaboration. And the third proposal was about letting go of divisions to embrace difference. And that was really a bit about what Jan was just talking about. It was about enlarging the humanitarian tent, that humanitarian organizations aren't the only people that can do humanitarian work. There's lived experience, there's diverse perspectives, there's private, there's public, and we should be embracing those differences rather than shunning them away. So as you can imagine, when I was given the opportunity to lead Start Network, which was a new organization with systems change in its DNA, I got very excited about putting my ideas into practice and really demonstrating how Time to Let Go could work. So for those of you who don't know, Start Network is a membership organization of more than 80 local, national, and international NGOs working across 5 continents. And the diversity of our network is by design, because we believe that by being a diverse network and bringing diverse experiences into humanitarian work, we represent the best of what humanitarian action has to offer. And at the heart of what we do is systems change. And we have 3 systemic shifts that we are trying to make. One is shifting power and visibility and influence to local organizations. The second is shifting resources to local organizations and increasingly in anticipation of crises. And the third is about shifting behavior, being more agile, more risk-willing as a sector, and really avoiding the racist and colonial practices that has dominated our system for so long. So, and importantly, one thing to mention is we do this through practical action by demonstrating and modeling the change that we want to see. So as you can imagine, what the last 3 years, now sort of 3 years into the job, what that's meant for me are kind of a few realizations. One, that it's much easier to sit in a think tank and write a paper about what everybody should be doing rather than trying to do it yourself. The second is it's much easier also to commit to change than to actually implement it. And I was really heartened to see that poll that you just took, because I imagined it was going to be a lot more skewed, as in we hadn't been able to change our practices. So the fact that you all have is real kudos to you, because I know from where I'm sitting how hard it's been. But it still seems to me like we all know what to do. We have policies, we have frameworks, we have commitments, we just don't do it. And so that is what Start Network is all about, is about demonstrating what we can do. So I thought I would just take a few minutes longer to reflect on what my last 3.5 years of Start Network have looked like, and where we have made some progress, and what has still been very, very difficult for us, and I imagine for all of you, as some of you are our members. So about shifting power, network power, decision-making and influence to local and national organizations, they give us about a B. I think we're doing okay on that. We now have a membership. We started out as an international NGO network. We now have a membership that's more than 50% local, 56% local, I think. And we also now have launched 11 locally led hubs, coalitions of civil society organizations, local, national, and international in 11 countries across the world. And what's working well for all of them is they're designing their own programs, they're raising their own funds, they're deciding together as a collective what to do to in terms of humanitarian action in their contexts. What has been more difficult, well, maybe just to give you a few examples of what that looks like, in our Pakistan hub, Pakistan raised its own funding, several million pounds worth of funding for the floods in Pakistan last summer. Our hub in Somalia has purchased an insurance premium that has now triggered and is now paid out to Somali and international organizations against the upcoming drought. Our leader in the Pacific sat next to the Secretary General of the UN at ECOSOC last year and talked about local leadership. So really, these hubs are coming into their own. I think what's been more difficult for the hubs is really that kind of complementarity between INGOs and local NGOs. INGOs in particular, finding it hard to find their feet in a locally led network. So what does an intermediary, what does the role of an intermediary look like? You know, what is the business model that we can adopt as international organizations that supports a role where our footprint is smaller and our direct delivery is much less? In terms of shifting funding to local organizations, we're doing okay there too. Our flagship Global Start Fund and our national funds in Nepal and Bangladesh have dispersed more than 100 million pounds to international, national, and increasingly local organizations through collective action. So one example of where a network can be fast, to the point that was made earlier in the first session, is we get funds allocated in 72 hours, and we get funding on the ground in a week. And that is by collective action about a coalition, a network deciding how that money is spent. We in Bangladesh and the Philippines, members are sharing their indirect cost recovery 50-50. And in our Start Fund in Bangladesh, they've given 100% of their funds to local organizations directly. Across the organization, we've given 38% of our funds directly to local organizations. The industry standard right now is 1.2%. We're doing better than that, but we all still need to do a lot better. One thing that is been hard about this is this concept of risk sharing and risk management, because I think, as we've acknowledged already today, this risk and compliance is still the single most, the largest blocker to localization in our sector. And it's still something that we all have to be working on. Which brings me to my last point, which is the third shift that we are trying to make, which is the shifting of practice and behavior. And that has been the slowest, and that has been the hardest, because it's about shifting mindsets, and shifting mindsets takes time. You know, in terms of our membership, our INGO members, some of whom are on this panel, have still concerns about legitimacy. What does an INGO, what's the legitimacy of an INGO in a locally led network? When we derive legitimacy from our ability to deliver, from our ability to have direct relationships with donors, what happens to that when we blow that up? What is our role going forward? INGOs have concerns about institutional sustainability. I talk a lot to the CEOs of our members, and also to their board chairs. And I think they're really caught between this tension of really wanting to localize sort of as an ambition, but organizational survival is a responsibility. And how do you square that circle? And finally, concerns about risk. As I said earlier, current approaches to risk, compliance, and accountability are the greatest impediments to localization, but they also hold the greatest operational potential to drive what this whole panel is about, which is about equitable partnerships. You know, INGOs describe being in the middle of a risk sandwich, where they're absorbing the risk from the donors, and they're also absorbing the risk from their local partners. What do we do about that risk sandwich? How can we get to more of an opportunity to share risk across all of our organizations? In Start Network, we're doing that through a series of tools and resources we're doing to manage risk on behalf of donors and manage risk on behalf of our organizations, our local members. We realize that not all organizations are going to be able to take on the risk profile that we take on, but there are some ways that we can kind of export to all of you, the membership, to manage risk a little bit more effectively. So I'll end now by just saying in 3.5 years, so I'm still at it, we're still at it, trying to change this system. And trying to really export the changes that we want to see so that we can turn what we see as innovation, as good practice, as bright lights across the sector into real transformation. And as Jan was saying, we're beginning to actually see transformation happening. But if there's anything that START Network has taught me is that remaking humanitarian action for the modern era is about action. It's not about buzzwords. It's not about frameworks. It's not about policies. It's not about commitments. It is about action alongside experimentation and risk-taking, reflection, learning, and course correction. And we all have to get better at that. And what the last 3 years of working with our membership, our international members, our national members, our local members has also taught me is that it's about time that we let go. Thanks.
So we're really interested to hear your perspective on equitable partnerships from the multiple angles through which you have observed this. Yeah, please share.
Thank you so much. First of all, it's a pleasure to be invited to speak here. It's my first time in Dublin and Ireland. And there's a lot of solidarity between, Ireland and Somalia, a special connection. Some great NGOs that are working in that context and have been working for so many years. And to be able to get, just appreciate your work here is something special. As you've said, I worked for 2 years in the government of Somalia and 3.5 years with a consortium of NGOs. It represented 100 NGOs that work in different regions across Somalia, both international and national. When I joined the organization, it was just after, the famine of 2011 that occurred, and lots of issues of organizations, local organizations that have actually been blacklisted because they were considered to have maybe diverted some of the aid money and so automatically, pushed out of the system. But the crisis was so big that at that time that you had to have challenges and some mistakes would happen. But those who were blamed for it were local NGOs, not the international NGOs. I'll elaborate this a bit more later. But for me, what equitable partnership means is a relationship that's based on trust, on transparency, on mutual accountability. It is long-term. It's ultimately also about serving, the beneficiaries in a better way and a more efficient way. And let me elaborate a bit on this. First of all, trust, because what I've observed when I came into the role is a trust deficit, right? On one side, mistrust towards locals. We have to be careful, monitor everything, scrutinize everything they're doing. And on the other side, criticism around aid, right? And therefore also the NGOs that are, and the NGOs that are behind this aid. As I said, particularly in the aftermath of the famine in 2011, you will have heard that at that time, within a space of few months, through 260,000 people died. And those were lives that could have been saved if interventions happened before that. And there was a lot of blame on donors who didn't come early enough for that response, but also on triggers and alarms bell that were not, that didn't come also earlier enough to raise that point or that concern. And so a lot of questions around, efficiency of the aid system came after that famine of 2011. And what doesn't help that trust, or what contributes to that trust deficit, is also the racism and colonization that Christina mentioned. And I'll give you one example of it. For example, just to be clear, I was the director of the NGO Consortium, Somali of origin. And when I joined in 2015, someone had the audacity to actually email the recruiting board and say, why are you recruiting a Somali into this position, right? This position, has to be someone who's neutral, who doesn't have biases, and so that person cannot do that job, right? Without knowing me, without knowing my qualifications, who I am, and never even saying me. So it just tells you that, there were biases, and there are still strong biases amongst ourselves that, that contribute to this mistrust. And it comes, from all angles. It's not just one angle. But I challenge, this conception that because you are from a certain country and you operate in your country and you're trying to, contribute to the humanitarian system, that by default you cannot be neutral. I think that if we had, to question the element of neutrality, every one of us has biases, right? Donors have, international NGOs have, the private sector has, the government has. There's no one that doesn't have biases. I say transparency because if you're local, or if you're, a citizen of a certain country, or you're a beneficiary of aid, then you want to know what that organization is doing in that country. I'm talking about, and not specifically in the headquarters. There's limited ways and opportunities for you to really find out what it's doing, right? And the jargon, we talk about accountability to affected people. Certainly the affected people need to also hold you accountable for what you're doing, tell you, if you're doing something good or bad. And an impact, indirect, let's say, impact of that, because I know I worked with the government, is that, governments have so many NGOs that work in their country, like in the case of Somalia, and they don't know what all of them are doing, right? And it creates some sentiment of frustration. We don't know, so we're going to try and put in restrictions to try and know what they're doing. And one of those mechanisms is NGO legislations that are restrictive, to try and control what you're doing, will get you to comply, and send documents everywhere everywhere for compliance. Again, there are, governments who generally want to restrict the space for civil society and do it, deliberately, but there are those who do it out of frustration. And, we talk a lot about local actors, and the assumption we have, because we work in the NGO sector, is that, we're talking about local NGOs, but there are many other local actors that play an important role in the humanitarian sphere. There's the private sector, right? And in our context, the private sector has been helpful in actually delivering aid where other agencies couldn't have access or didn't have access. But also there's the government, right? In fragile and conflict-affected states, governments are extremely weak. And the service delivery is mainly done by NGOs and civil society. And of course, it's important to empower local civil society, but we also have to be careful that it's not done in a way that it also weakens the local system and the local governments. I could go along talking about, so many challenges that we faced around in Somalia, but one of the positive things that we've had there is the amount of local talents, right? Local talents coming both from international NGOs and local NGOs, right? And one of the challenges, we talked about the colonization and biases and racism. It took time really for the international NGOs even to have, Somalis as country directors of those international NGOs, even though on paper, they were more qualified than the internationals that would come or change every 3 years, and knew the context much better than any one of them. The first one to actually appoint a country director who was a local in Somalia is Concern Worldwide. Kudos to them. And now we have, more and more organizations doing that. And actually they're realizing it's not actually such a bad thing. So what are some of the challenges I've seen? I mean, Christina talked about risk and the risk transfer, especially in the aftermath of the 2011 famine. It doesn't just happen between INGOs and local NGOs. It also happens within INGOs themselves. We have the issue of people being based in Nairobi and working in Somalia. And what you see is all the expats being based in Nairobi and all the local staff being based in Somalia. Not sure how equitable that is, right? Certainly, they would face the same amount of risk that you would face if you were to move back there. But also around, power dynamics, and I think Christina mentioned it as well, is that INGOs come with a lot of influence, right? Influence with the donor, and influence in the humanitarian system as a whole to bring change, right? Local NGOs were screaming for years about, their space in the humanitarian sphere, and it's only when others started speaking about it that, we realized, oh, this is actually a problem that we need to address. And to actually balance those power dynamics, we need power brokers, right? People who are going to mediate that space. The think tanks, the donors, and others. And I think, what we are moving away is a realization of all the problems we faced over the years. I think, yes, maybe we haven't moved. I was also at the World Humanitarian Summit that much since, in terms, challenges or addressing localization or providing more funding to local actors. But now there's a realization, a serious realization, I think, that things must change. And, the fact that we're talking about decolonization, we couldn't talk about that 10 years ago. Anyone who'd mention racism in the sector would be seen as crazy or talking about nonsense. But now we're talking about it. So things are changing, but we want to change faster, right? At fast-paced ways. But we also want to understand in that changing space what also other impacts this is having. And I talked about local governments playing an important role. Solutions, and this is the last point. I mean, for me, it's very simple. It's engaging when we're talking about local NGOs, particularly in a strategic partnership with an organization, a long-term one, provide them with the skills and know-how on how to take over the leadership gradually and drive that humanitarian and development response. We have to get ready for success and failures as well. Accept that there will be failures in that process. Not everything works. Not every model is perfect. But whilst you do that, I think it's important that, like in the humanitarian system, we used to talk about these humanitarian cartels and big, large NGOs that influence the humanitarian system, that we're not just, supporting a selected group of organizations. We are helping the sector grow. We're helping the sector improve. And we're also helping the sector hold those who are in power accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdurahman, and especially for putting so many different types of partnerships on the table for discussion. I think for your glimmers of hope, regardless of the pace of change, perhaps. You'll come back to that. So our third panelist is Michael from Christian Aid. Christian Aid is a partnership agency, always has been a partnership agency and a faith agency. And Christian Aid has been part of the journey since 2016, signed up to the Charter for Change, recently signed up to the Pledge for Change, very vocal in the discussions and debates and dialogues that we've had. What has changed within Christian Aid in terms of partnership? What are the sort of tangible actions that you have taken as an agency on this journey towards equitable or fair and just partnerships?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, there's two kinds of change that we've been trying to do. So one kind of change is to change our own to improve the kind of empowering dimension of our own partnerships with our local partners. We work with about 200 local partners in 27 countries, so we're quite a small to medium-sized NGO in a way. There are a lot of actors in the system who are much bigger than us. So the amount of funding we actually spend is really small in comparison to all the funding that's being delivered by the sector as a whole. So I think in order to make a difference, we've also seen it important to try to work with allies like all of us on this panel, like Start Network and Trokra. I find much better at pronouncing the Start Network than at pronouncing Trokra. To kind of, you know, fight for change in the sector as a whole, which will have more impact. So, I mean, in Christian aid, some of the changes that we ourselves have made are I mean, I think there's quite a strong movement now where everybody is trying to do this, but we started sharing overhead costs with partners, which I think now quite a lot of people are thinking is a useful thing to do, because I think a lot of the time our partners, if we don't share over costs with them, then a lot of the funding they receive is very tied to specific projects that are funded, and then they don't have obvious funding to enable their institutions to thrive. They don't have obvious funding for their security guards or their drivers or training for their staff or their HR department or their office or keeping the lights on or whatever it might be. They just have funding for the deliverables of projects. So they find it difficult to thrive financially from project to project. So we started giving half the funding that we received from donors for overheads to our partners. So we kept half for ourselves to keep our own lights on, and we gave half the partner. And also in programs that are funded by our supporters, we're giving a 10% overhead to the partners. So if it's £100,000 program, we're giving them £110,000 so that they can hopefully enable their institutions to thrive better. And then another thing we've decided to do is to move away from implementing programs directly ourselves. So we used to implement programs directly ourselves for quite substantial financial gain in DRC and Ethiopia and Northeast Nigeria and Cox's Bazar, with funding from the World Food Programme and IOM and OCHA. And we decided to cancel that because we decided if we worked only through partners, then it would enable, you know, partners to have a leadership space in our programming, and we wouldn't be competing with other, you know, local and national actors for funding from WFP and IOM in those settings, and we'd have greater clarity for our whole staff about direction we were traveling in. It would give us more credibility to influence others. Another thing we've done is we recognised over time that a lot of the funding that we were getting ended up being invested in our own infrastructure. So if my mum gives some money to Christian Aid, the small English and Irish NGO, an awful lot of that money goes into my enormous salary, and not so much goes to poor people in need in you know, Ethiopia and South Sudan and Kenya. We recognised, and so we decided to set this benchmark where when we get appeals from our public supporters and the churches that support us in Britain and Ireland, we try to give 80% of the money we get to partners in the affected country, so they can spend it helping people in need, and we try to only keep 20% of the funding we get invested in our own infrastructure and costs and our own staffing. But sometimes we're willing to be a little bit flexible with that if the situation, if the particular setting suggests that we need a little bit more funding to enable the programs to work better. And then we signed up to the Pledge for Change, as you said, which and I think one of the things, I mean, previously, like you said, we are a member of the Charter for Change, which Trok is obviously a very active and energetic and influential member in as well. And I think the thing about Charter for Change is it's really alongside the other international members. One of the things we've done is we've put the leadership of charter change in a local partner. So originally it was run by a local partner in India, and then we've transferred it to a local partner in Uganda. So now there's kind of local leadership of charter change. We've got 600 national and local actors who've signed up to Charter for Change. So now when you have a Charter for Change meeting, the national and local voices are incredibly kind of powerful and influential in the meeting. It's a dialogue between international and national members, but increasingly over time, the national members have become more powerful, more numerous, and more confident. So they have a really strong influence over the direction of travel. But the thing about Charter for Change is a lot of the agencies within it are agencies like Trocra who kind of had a partnership model already before they signed a Charter for Change. So the idea of signing a Charter for Change and committing to all these kind of noble partnership promises isn't really an enormous change to their existing practice. It sort of like reflects what they were already trying to do to some extent. So it's not really changing the world. There's lots of members there from Caritas, from the ACT Alliance, kind of small and medium-sized NGOs, and they're not making enormous changes to their practice in delivering what the Charter says. But in the Pledge for Change, I think the two things that are different are that the Pledge for Change that we've now signed up to, which is sort of complements the Charter for Change, there's a lot of agencies who signed up to it who are much bigger than most of the agencies in Charter for Change, so they have more reach, so they kind of work with far more people affected by humanitarian crisis. So they've got potential to make a bigger difference to the way the sector operates. And many of them have a tradition of operating through direct implementation. So it's quite a significant shift for them to make these pledges to become partnership-led organizations in the main. I mean, one of the things that the Pledge for Change claims is that the organizations within it, as soon as it's realistic, will operate through partners wherever possible and feasible and useful, and only operate in direct implementation where they can't find a partner who could do the job effectively. And if that's the case, then as soon as possible, they'll strengthen the capacity of partners in that humanitarian setting in order to enable them to take a lead role. And so I think the fact that a lot of traditionally non-localization friendly organizations have jumped onto that bandwagon is an encouraging sign that change is coming in the sector. And the other thing about it is that I think the Grand Bargain and Charter for Change, most of the way that it's held accountable is by self-reporting. So we're required to self-report to the Grand Bargain and Charter for Change every year, and to say how well we're doing and what we're doing less well. But with the Pledge for Change, our idea is that a significant part of the reporting framework will be that we ask our local partners to judge us and to do the report on whether we're actually demonstrating the empowering practice that we claim to hope to be. And I think that is that's a more attractive model, because I think self-reporting, you've got an opportunity to sort of, pretend to be better than you are, but with reporting by your local partners, I think it holds you to account better. And I do see, I mean, like the previous panelists were eloquently saying, I do see, significant change in the sector, at least in that now everybody in the sector is saying that it's the right thing to do to empower local partners and put them in a leading role. So that's become absolutely unanimously agreed throughout the sector practically, hasn't it? And that wasn't the case in 2015. I remember in 2015, we used to have meetings about these things in Geneva, and at that time, Christina, among others, was trying to lobby for, at that time, that 20% of funding ought to go to local partners. And I remember, very senior staff in Norwegian Refugee Council at that time were kind of, ridiculing this suggestion that 20% of funding should go to local partners and saying that's never going to happen. It's ridiculous. What's the point of putting forward stuff that's ridiculous? But now you have Mr. Egeland, very senior person in NRC, coming on the screen, really promoting that 25% of funding needs to get to local partners. So, it's quite a significant change in the intervening 8 years in what the important and powerful people in the sector are talking about, which gives hope. That I agree that it's obviously been far too slow to achieve what we're trying to achieve, but it's coming.
Thank you, Michael. So thank you, Michael. A new metric for us is the attitude of senior leaders such as Jan Egeland I think you've put lots of tangible and action-oriented suggestions on the table. Percentages of ICR, fair overheads. You've been really brave in letting go of some of those large contracts that you talked about, direct implementation, the 360-degree performance management almost that your local partners will now undertake. So thank you for that and for those ideas. We've one more panelist that we'll listen to before we open the floor, and that's Mary from Goal. Goal is probably known out there as the agency that's really fast into a conflict situation or a difficult crisis situation, fast to get up and going and responding to needs. But actually, Mary's going to talk to us about a very different way of operating and implementing in a very difficult context. So over to you, Mary.
Thanks very much, Noreen. Am I on? I don't know if it was deliberate or inspired by Dóchas to invite a former head of compliance to the panel and a current head of risk. So behind my title of external relations, I've really been one of the leaders in Goal, one of the part of many people and a really strong function around compliance and risk. And so I'm going to bring something of a tapestry to the speaking today, just talk about how we do our business in very difficult and fragile contexts. And we are part of this movement. There's very robust conversation about partnership in Goal right now. We're establishing a partnership hub in Uganda with funding from Irish Aid. We are very determined that our mission and our theory of change, which is all about working with local agencies and communities and local resources, which was really inspired by the Grand Harvest. We are determined to live that mission. We are headquartered in Dundee. For those of you who don't know us, we are currently operational in 14 countries. We had program expenditure budget last year of 212 million euro across those 14 countries. I can say, as Director of External Relations, as head of compliance, as head of risk, that working in partnership in fragile and protracted conflict settings has been complex. Negotiating, managing, leveraging partnerships in those challenging settings to the best effect for all parties should be a topic for extensive discussion. But in the short time we have today, I'm going to talk to you about our largest program, which is in Northwest Syria. Like previous speakers, we're committed to this. And I wanted to say that there are three types of partnerships that I want to speak about. Traditional civil society actors, the private sector, and local governing actors. Those are all extremely important to Goal. They are part of how we see working locally. So I will be bold. I will say that we have a 100 million euro program in Syria. We have been there for 10 years. Our way of working is heavily dependent on working through the systems that are there and protecting the systems that are there so that when that awful conflict ends, systems have not been destroyed and recovery can come faster. That's why when we say we work with partners, we really do mean the private sector. We really do mean local government. We were captured, our way of working was captured by Harvard and the London School of Economics. And I've asked Dóchas only to put up one slide, and it is the publication which tried to capture how we've done what we've done, which is reach 1 million people every single year in Syria, in this crisis. How do we do it? And it's very much based on working through local actors. But I will say, we off-grant or on-grant, I can never get the phrase right. We on-grant to 7 different traditional civil society partners, 10% of that budget. That is something we're working on. That is something that we're committed to in terms of increasing it as the partnerships provide opportunity. I want to say that we work with Shafak, which is a protection and vocational training expert, and Ishan, an expert in gender-based violence, case management, and humanitarian leadership. We have these deep and lasting partnerships with these individual agencies, these 2 among our 7 or 8. And we have 4 what we call stakeholders in our arrangements. We have our program participants. They're our primary benefactor of the partnerships because they're experiencing more expertise through our partnerships. You know that we achieve our sustainable development and lasting impact, but that's the principle we're aiming for. On a practical basis, what we do is we extend our reach into areas that we could not otherwise get. We understand better the local dimensions of social exclusion. That's not for us to know as we walk in from external. No external partner, no external agency could know that here in Ireland as well as an Irish partner. We also extend appropriately to each partner. We benefit from what we have learned, what we can bring to other areas. Our partner benefits from what we have brought to the discussion. But there's other stakeholders, and they are donors. And donors benefit from the visibility of local leadership, local agency, local leaders, building peace and development. If we aren't working with local actors, donors won't see it and it won't shift. And our supporters need to understand. I will say this. Many of you, and thank you for those of you who reached out to us, you know we lost 32 colleagues in the recent. It was interesting to me. We didn't intend necessarily early in that discussion to talk about the staff that we had lost. We didn't know how to talk about them. And I will say that it came out in a conversation in the media, unintended, I'll be honest. And we had to think long and hard, quick, not long and hard, quick and hard. How do we manage this? As soon as it went out that staff had died, and I do not judge the media for this, but we received numerous calls. What county were they from? What GAA club? And we stood firm. We lost humanitarian actors, not in the line of duty. You know they died in an earthquake. We lost them escaping their homes or in their homes. We lost 32 humanitarian leaders, whatever their nationality, whatever their lives were dedicated to humanitarian action. And I was really, really, really proud that Gold stood firm and said, this is humanitarian action. You might have heard, I was on News at 1 saying, this is real humanitarian action. So I know I was on the earlier panel and I didn't say it, but I really wanted to bring that out because I think it's very important for us to understand and to name that the vast bulk of humanitarian action is done locally by local people who know local circumstances, and they are at the most risk in any circumstance. So that at our core, I want to name that about working with local staff and working with local partners. But I do want to talk about the complexities. The opportunities are this greater reach. The opportunities are the greater knowledge. The opportunity is the sustainable development and the lasting outcomes. But I do want to talk about some of the risks and how we manage some of those risks, because I would be remiss if I didn't. If I said it was easy, if I said it was straightforward to work in one of the largest protracted conflicts in the world that's been going on with more proxy interests than any other, I'd be lying to you. It is complex, and we do it with a very robust set of standard operating procedures, which intend to protect the humanitarian principles that people support us for: independence, neutrality, impartiality, and humanitarianism. And we believe it's correct for us to defend those with robust standard operating processes. So I'm part of a complaints response group. We have a community feedback mechanism in Syria that takes almost 200,000 inputs from community members every single year to make sure we are hearing. And they can do it through Telegram, they can do it through WhatsApp, they can do it through the letterbox, they can do it in person. We have every mode and modality of making sure that the community is speaking to us first and foremost. But the standard operating procedures are there for us to really, really, really stridently protect the interests of all parties in that conflict. Navigating and balancing access to areas which are governed by complex governing actors, I'm going to use that, is very delicate. We do it only successfully for 10 years because of these procedures, in which we set out very clearly how we will do participant selection, how we will do post-distribution monitoring, how we will do evaluations, how we will coordinate a distribution to serve the people in consultation with the people and will not be interfered with. We have a fairly predictable standard approach to 3 strikes and you're out. If we get an allegation that our distributions, our work with the community is interfered with by a complex governing actor, we send a graduated set of warning letters. And on the 3rd one, we suspend programming with that partner for a specified period of time, because our attempt to be neutral, and I absolutely understand that we all come with baggage, but our attempt is to protect the humanitarian principles through the way we work in really complex settings. And we have been able to, through partners and through working with these local governing actors and with private sector. We work with 60 bakeries. We subsidize yeast and we subsidize grain for 10 years to make sure that our market system stays awake and functioning and is not destroyed, so that when the conflict ends, it's still there. We work through 60 water stations and the public water system because we believe in a systems approach with the parts of the government that are continuing to work, and we support them so that when the conflict ends, we're not moving from water trucking back to a whole retrogressive way of people accessing water. Potable water is available in Northwest Syria. 4 million people in a county the size of Galway. So I wanted to just really reference that. In working in crises and conflicts, we're navigating security risks every single day. Our people are walking into delicate conversations that are dangerous, that are personally dangerous for reputations, that are sometimes physically dangerous. Our partners are doing it. We do regular security assessments for that security issue. But we also work with our partners in investigations, on community feedback mechanisms. We've recently invested in all of our partners having stronger reporting and monitoring systems. Not so they can report to us, so that they are stronger when we leave, so that they're capable and have our shared expertise. So I think what I wanted to bring was a sense that we have attempted to have strong compliance. We have attempted to be very risk aware of how, in such a setting, we can find the humanitarian principles challenged. And we've tried to develop a system that is both respectful and capacity sharing for the partners and the local community, private sector, and the governing agencies, but also ensures that those principles are at the core of what we do. I'll leave it at that.
So thank you so much, Mary, for painting that very graphic picture, I think, of your life, as well as your program in the northwest of Syria. I think you'll agree we've got some brilliant perspectives across the 4 panelists of what equitable partnership means, both in terms of challenges as well as practical actions, as well as opportunities. Building blocks of equitable partnerships have been referred to. So the building of trust, I think Abdurahman spoke to that very clearly. Risk sharing, both Mary and Christina talked to it. Capacity sharing, resource sharing, and then the hardest of all, power sharing. But I think we do need to acknowledge that resource sharing and the flow of funds is probably one of those indicators that has not moved, or certainly from the Grand Bargain report this year, the funding that is reported through the FTS, and I'll read it out. The recent FTS data shows that while the volume of funding to local and national actors has increased in volume terms, as all humanitarian funding has increased, in percentage terms, it has declined from 3.4% in 2020 to 2.3% in 2021 and 1.8% in 2022. is the question I'll put to the panel, whoever is brave enough. So we've talked about trust, capacity, sharing risk, shifting power. But if we don't get the funding right, if we don't get a shift, a turn in the trend towards funding of local actors, are we ever going to move more clearly towards locally led humanitarian action? Get your questions ready while they're thinking about who will answer that.
I'll throw a comment in. I think that where you have seen some success is with agencies. Possibly, I don't know the full total size of Christian Aid. Michael, you've been very modest there, describing yourselves as small to medium. That's what I would say goal is, 200 million. Very proud of an Irish agency set up by John O'Shea 47 years ago. That could be size. Brilliant, right? Brilliant that we have an agency like that. Same trope for concern, others. What I would say is, I think we're shifting our agencies. Goal is gone 10% in Syria. I've just described the context. 17% of our funding in other parts of the world is going to partners. So we're moving. And I would say it's agencies at our size. I would ask about the larger, some of the bigger players, should they remain nameless? They might be associated. I wonder, could we watch this? I was at an OECD meeting and they were saying that some of the big bilaterals, some of the big multilaterals are not very transparent on partnership funding. So I would say it's almost easier to get transparency from somebody like Gold. You should see our audited accounts for don't. But it's easy to pick it out. It's easy to find it in agencies our size. So I would wonder where the problem is. And I think we as agencies of our size should continue to move it, but we won't move the dial. We won't move the dial. Those numbers are coming down because there's much bigger money going in much bigger ways. I think probably not to local partners. I'll leave it at that.
I mean, I think that the figures you're talking about are direct funding to local actors, but I think that a lot of like Mr. Egeland was saying in his video, I think a lot of donors don't find it easy to do direct funding to local actors. So they give funding through the Red Cross or through the UN or through NGOs. And we don't actually know how much funding arrives to local actors through one intermediary because we haven't got sophisticated enough kind of data systems to measure it. So the actual amount of funding going to local actors is by one intermediary is unknown. And I think it would help if we invested in better data systems to enable us to know that, because then we'd be better able to sort of make sure that we improve in the way we should if we know where we stand. But I think I think you're right that it's about quality and quantity. But I think one of the challenges with trying to emphasize quantity is that because of the complex compliance requirements of a lot of the international funding system, in order to get very significant amounts of funding at scale to local actors, I think it incentivizes us to work with local actors who are quite kind of big, sophisticated, capital-based kind of local actors who look a bit like INGOs. And I think that's not necessarily the only kind of local actor that we should be hoping to work with, because I think if we were able to get funds to more grassroots, community-based, smaller organizations who don't have the infrastructure to satisfy all the compliance requirements that the system often requires, then they're actually the ones who are closest to communities they serve and best placed to identify who the most vulnerable people in those communities are and provide assistance that really responds to communities' aspirations and needs. So I think there's a risk that in aspiring for maximal quantity, we end up supporting big local organizations who are no doubt doing fantastic work, but who aren't, in my view, the only type of local actors that we want to empower.
Thank you, Michael. Christina, do you want to comment on this before we open to the floor?
Yeah, maybe just quickly, just to say that I maybe slightly disagree with you, Michael, on this. I do think that it is about getting significant quantities of funding flowing in the right directions and through the right channels. And I don't think that I think if we fail to do that, we will never move the needle on any of these ground bargain commitments that we've made, or all of these commitments to work through local partners. I think there are really strong incentives across the sector for keeping our organizations alive and large. And until we find those business models that allow us to operate effectively, to allow our organizations to flourish, perhaps with a smaller footprint, perhaps with more niche, those incentives will never shift. I think we also, and then this is going to be a running theme in everything I say, we have to get this risk sharing right. At the moment, our compliance regimes are bureaucratic, they're expensive, and they're disproportionate to the amount of money we're talking about when supporting local organizations. And until we open that conversation up and we agree to share risk across the entire humanitarian supply chain, so donor, intermediary, final recipient of aid, that financial flow will not happen. And until those financial flows happen in the right direction, through the right channels, we won't get this done.
Thank you. And we might come back to risk because it is around compliance, but also around security and safety and visibility, reputation. Let's invite questions from the floor. I'm sure you have lots and lots of them. So I'm going to leave it to the colleagues with the microphones to choose the questions that are coming up. We have one here in the middle. If you would state your name, your agency, and who you'd like to direct your question to.
Yes, hi, I'm Anya Hanrahan. I'm with the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence, and first just want to thank all of you. Something that, you know, Mary would be very aware of, and the ICGBV did a lot of work around women, peace and security last year, and we were promoting local voices to the UN Security Council, and something that kept coming up as quite frustration for the particularly local women's voices was the lack of funding, the lack of capacity development, and the grassroots movements being a little bit overlooked when it comes to the funding and the direction and the support that they have. We all know that women's organizations, unfortunately, are receiving a lot less funding than the majority of others in complicated or conflict areas. And I guess my question would be kind of, how are your organizations really directing your support towards women-led and women-focused organizations, and how are you supporting them in getting to those bigger funding opportunities, and what direction do you see this movement going in? Because I think you're already doing phenomenal work. It's just it's complicated for women organizations, especially when their capacity is being limited in different areas.
Thank you. We'll take 3 questions altogether before we come back to the panel. There was a hand here. Ruben?
Hi. It's Ruben Haylett from Trocra. Just probably a comment that you made, Abdurahman, that really you felt change doesn't come without the power brokers. And you mentioned donors and think tanks. I'd just like to come back to the group, to the others, and ask what actions and who need to be these power brokers to move the dial. I had the impression that the chart of change was the choir singing, who are already standing in the choir, not getting the people who need to move into the choir. But from all sides, just interested to know where you think these power brokers and who they are.
Thank you, Ruben. And one more. Mark, just behind you.
Thank you. Mark Johnson, Concern Worldwide. And actually this meeting comes on the day this morning where we actually had a very productive meeting on our own localization position and how we're going to bring that forward. But my question to the panel, and particularly to Abdurahman, when we say equitable partnerships, is this term in itself a bit troubling? Because the way that we have to enter into partnerships with local organizations is as a role of intermediary. And that immediately forces us to enter the relationship by looking at compliance of the local partner. And can you really build trust and genuine mutual equitable partnership as described? And then more generally to the panel, like, is this something as INGOs that we need to kind of push back maybe and advocate to donors? Because it's all well and good for ECHO to provide a guide on equitable partnerships, but if they are putting us in this position of not actually being able to have genuine equitable partnerships, is this something that we need to say?
One of those wicked questions, I think, that was mentioned in the earlier panel. Okay, let's take those three, and we might have one more very quick round. Time is never on our side. Abdurahman?
Yeah, just to answer that first difficult question, I think, look at what happened in 2011, right? Many organizations did that compliance with local NGOs, right? And everything on paper was all right, right? But then what happened is you had a big, massive injection of funding in a very short space of time, right? That means that, it creates a lot of risk, a lot of challenges that the local partner can't even manage, right? And rather than supporting it through that process, what some organizations said that, we didn't commit any mistake, it's the local partner, it's their fault, and therefore, they were all blacklisted and challenged, etc. I think, it's the mindset that we need to change. We're always looking at compliance, audit reports, etc. Right? And look at what difference the people you want to support or you want to work with can make, and find the way that works, regardless of whether they have the paperwork or not to do it. That's the point. And I think that's the point that colleague mentions about grassroots organizations. That's the point that Michael says, it's not just the bigger ones who have all the compliance, it's also the others, right? And the ones that are coming now, there are growing civil society and NGOs and local partners that are growing and coming up. We talked about Syria. In Syria, 12 years ago, correct me if I'm wrong, there was no local civil society, right? Because the government was restricting, and they came up and they were supporting the process, and that's how this partnership was built, I believe. So it's the mindset that needs to change, I think, very importantly. And in the power relationship, I think, you're asking about the power brokers and who are the power brokers. We probably need, further study or research into that. But the way I see it is that those who hold power are those who have resources, right? And the more you have resources, the more you have money, the more you have power. That's the way the world is, and the nature is. And this pledge for change that you mentioned, and there are two parties that are fighting in the space, right? Competing. And I think what that space is, it's not just also, international NGOs. We talked about the multilateral system. Jan England talked about, the United Nations. There are a variety of parties that are competing in this space. And I think that for me, those, that can really try to balance that space are those who are going to give the money, the donors, right? So the fact that now they are realizing that, this is an important issue, they're able, to set the standards. And some of these actors will have to be, both local and international, strong at influencing that process. It's not going to be easy, because we are still, we're overhauling the system and changing the system in a way that is more locally driven and locally owned. And there's going to be a lot of, reservations around that. That's the way I see it. Okay.
Thank you. Would any of the panel like to speak to women-led organizations and their role within this whole movement towards locally led humanitarian action?
I was going to address that, if that's okay. Thank you for your question on that. So we have an emerging hub in South Sudan. And as I described before, our hubs are sort of coalitions of civil society organizations that get together to do programming together or start a fund together, whatever it is they decide. And our South Sudan hub is led by a network of women-led organizations. So the emphasis in that hub is going to be on women-led organizations and how to support them. And the conversations that we have with the South Sudan hub and with all our hubs is, how do you define local? Because what we don't do is we don't take the IASC definition of local and kind of put it up there as a START network definition. We don't take, there are lots of definitions out there and we don't use them. What we use is something called diversity criteria, and we let each hub decide on its own what is local to them. And those diversity criteria comprise of things like, where's your head office? Who's on your board? Do you have access to an international brand? Do you have access to an international fundraising architecture? And you're sort of, I think most organizations are on some kind of spectrum between local and international because everybody's sort of operates in a different way. And what we're also trying to get at is to prioritize those organizations that don't have access to an international brand, that aren't part of a family of organizations, that don't have access to a fundraising architecture that they can tap into when they need it, or that gives them kind of core funding every year. Those truly local organizations that are locally owned, locally rooted, and making sure that we prioritize them in all of our hubs. So I think it's about asking what is local and making sure that those are the organizations you prioritize. And one more point on that is this trend now for international NGOs to nationalize their offices in country. And those offices then call themselves local and then get funding from different sort of national pots and things like that. And I think what I would say is that's not the transformation, that's not going to lead to transformation. Hiring, I mean, I take your point that having, you know, national staff or staff from the country leading these organizations is really important, but it's also really important not to poach those people from local organizations and to support, instead of building up your own nationalized organization, support the organizations that already exist by building them up through organizational strengthening and cost recovery sharing and things like that. So I think there are ways we can get to the grassroots organizations, the smaller organizations that don't have access to all of the things that we do in these forums or that we do even through our country offices. Thanks.
Thank you. And let's watch that space in South Sudan. Isn't that a great good news story that a woman-led hub would come out of South Sudan? 2 more questions, and then we need to move to wrapping up this session. So I can see 2, 1 and 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for the input. My name is Sarah Fennell with Trocra, and I was just reflecting there, and it's something we've been thinking about in our own organization. For many years, we viewed our role as strengthening civil society, and that kind of being an end in itself. And in 2006, I remember during a new strategic plan, a lot of debate in the organization whether our objective was really poverty impact reduction and whether that's what we should be measuring and looking at, or whether it was really to leave the legacy of a strong, resilient civil society. I think on pressure of funding, accountability, results frameworks, we started measuring poverty reduction, and we neglected to look at the institutions with whom we were partnering in delivering that. And it's interesting, whenever we do a survey now with our partners and ask, what could we do more of? They say, increase our organizational resilience, give us that ICR, which we're now doing, etc. So my question, I guess, is, Christine, a little bit on that business model. It's not an attractive business model for the Irish public, where you might get some of your fundraising, and often for donors, to say that that is the object. How do you communicate that? Because what we need to return to everybody who invests in us and supports us is poverty reduction. So I suppose just that business model, or, you know, the goals, etc. But to really look at investing in strong, resilient civil society as an end in itself, which is localization or locally led development. How does that translate into a business model? I'd love to hear any thoughts you have, Christina. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Aideen from Oxfam Ireland, and my question follows on very well from yours because it's also about civil society. So everybody spoke very interestingly about delivery of aid, and I wanted to ask about impact on aid and on donors and on the sphere. So in Oxfam, we've made our efforts to kind of pass the microphone and share platforms, for example, at parliamentary committees, giving our space to an activist from Kenya in spaces like that. And Abdurahman, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about the best practice for giving space to local actors to influence the humanitarian sphere and to influence donors. And what's the best way to do that? Thank you.
Thank you. Who'll go first?
I can take the first question on the business model, just to say that, so we're going through our own strategy process now, and we're having that same conversation. Are we about humanitarian outcomes, or are we about social transformation? And I don't have an answer for you about that yet, but we're in that kind of same space. Where is it about, what is the end game? Is the end game to build an effective network an effective locally led network? Or is the outcome better outcomes, or is the end game better outcomes for people affected by an at-risk crises? And yeah, I think there's a thread, that the needle that we're going to thread on that one probably. But on business models, we're playing with a few, because this is the business model that we're designing for our own network. And we're faced with the same constraints that I think you are. What we're coming up with as a really effective business model for ourselves is one as a service provider. And what that means is that we are an enabler of other organizations to do the work. We pride ourselves in brokering relationships with donors, with other partners, with private sector. We pride ourselves in developing specialist expertise that then we can provide as services to our partners. In our case, it's disaster risk financing and risk modeling and things like that. We also hold grants for others. We hold grants, we host programs when local organizations can't by law, or because they don't have enough of a track record, or because they don't have the back office operations to actually process grants. So that is another service that we provide. And while we aren't charging for those services, I think that is a business model as an INGO you might adopt. You could be a grant custodian. You could be a center of excellence for a particular expertise. I also think one other really important role for international organizations is scale. If we have a crisis that's across multiple countries, the international community is the only one that's going to be able to provide the scale, that's going to be able to get those helicopters in. I mean, whether it's the Indian Ocean tsunami or something happening in the Karakoram Mountains of Pakistan, the international sector has a lot to provide when it comes to scale and special equipment and expertise. So I think there's always a role there too.
Great.
Yeah, on the influencing, it's a very interesting question, and interesting point. I think you have different levels of influencing. First of all, it starts in country, and then you can go to the capitals and where the decisions are made. But in the countries, you have those spaces of influencing, like I'm talking about the humanitarian country teams, for instance, where you can have stronger local voices being represented in those platforms. But at the international level, there's these bodies like the ISC, Interagency Standing Committee, that also are important spaces of influence and where you can challenge the big organizations. But we do face challenges in those spaces, because I've been on the HCT in my context, and we had 3 local NGOs, 3 international NGOs, and sometimes you have people that are scared to speak out because you have donors in the room and you have potential funders in the room. So it's not necessarily, they don't feel necessarily that it's a safe space to address and speak out about those challenges, because it's scared about how it may impact on them. And I have very good friends who, because they've spoken out about those things, were seen also perceived negatively in that space. The second thing is you have to speak as a group, right? Not as an individual organization. It's only the collective and the collective voice that will bring difference and bring change. If the Oxfams and the concerns and the Trocaire, I hope I pronounce it well, come together, that's what's going to make a difference. And we still have challenges in those humanitarian coordination, platforms and systems and mechanisms, less at the local level, I would say, because now there's a growing understanding that there should be more spaces, but more at the headquarters levels. And then I'll not talk if you're inviting, obviously, partners to speak and to influence that space about, all the visa issues and the things they have to face, challenges to just, go and travel and get their voices heard.
Thank you so much for those responses. I'm afraid we are out of time for this session. I feel like we could go on for some more hours. I certainly have a list of questions here I haven't had a chance to ask myself. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to sum up in one action what they believe would move the dial on equitable partnerships. So from across all of those building blocks that we've heard about today, I'm asking each of you to choose just one that you would put your money on in terms of changing the dial and the pace of change towards locally led humanitarian action. We are at the same time, because we can multitask, going to create a word cloud. So the question to you, and let's have everybody into Mentimeter now, use just one word, the one word that you would choose to describe equitable partnership. The one word. So you'll see the website, www.menti.com, and the code, same code, just one word. If you can enter your words while the panel are giving their one action. Mary, we'll start with you. Is that fair?
Well, I'm going to quickly say two. I had said to Noreen, who briefed me on this question, I was going to mention that we're now doing this 360 organizational capacity assessment with our partners, so they get to talk back to us about the kind of silly things that we ask around compliance and the too much detail and the too much oversight, and that's been really empowering. But I want to say, my role gives me a really interesting interface, not only with compliance, not only with partner compliance, but also with donors. I am not seeing a backdrop of of an increased appetite for donor risk right now. I'm going to say that. There's a strong worry about risk amongst our donors. And I think the big thing we should be doing is coming together and talking to donors about how unrealistic their appetite for risk is in the context of the localization agenda. The two are competing with each other. In my experience, when I try to interface with donors about this is what we're seeing, and I don't get much latitude, I get a fair bit of worry and concern. And of course, I share that coming from where I come from in terms of the roles that I have. So I would say that there's probably things we do have to do with partners that could have immediate effect at releasing some of that energy that has been talked about. But it really has to happen with donors releasing some of that risk, that really strong risk aversion now. And I'm wondering if we're going to have to wait a while for the pendulum to swing back, just to be realistic about that. Thanks.
Challenge for Dóchas there, I think. Abdurahman.
I think similar. It's really what we need is donor commitment, right? Walk the talk. We heard from Jan England that there's some big donors now that are entering this space. We mentioned USAID. We mentioned ECHO, right? It's not just about the talk. We need to see the funds on the table and how much and how they're going to allocate these funds to local actors. And I think once you have these 2, 3, 4, 5 big donors coming in that space and starting, delivering in that space, the rest will follow.
Excellent, thank you.
So I'm going to say risk sharing, because that's what I'm always going to say to this question. Seriously, if you want to do one impactful thing tomorrow, it would be change the way that you approach risk. And I'm speaking to all of the Dóchas members here as fellow INGOs, but I'm also noticing Irish Aid in the front row here, and I'm speaking to you. As INGOs, it means embracing the risk sandwich that we are all in. It is your role as we transition for the moment. Offer good risk management to your partners by offering mentoring, organizational strengthening, and technical support, and that will someday shift. Share your indirect cost recovery with them, because again, they will become stronger for it. And then the risk sandwich will start to become an open sandwich. That's a terrible analogy. And then ask your donors to do the same. Ask your donors to adopt a different risk profile as well, because I think, as all of us have been saying, we need to all work together across the supply chain on this. And I'm looking at Irish Aid now and asking you to do a few things too. And I do have to say that Irish Aid has been on the journey with Start Network on this and has been a very enabling partner to help us adopt a better risk profile vis-a-vis our local partners. But to donors, support your INGO partners in managing that risk themselves. By just considering the proportionality of any burdens that you're putting on them. You really need all of that from your partners, because they're going to need to get all of that down the line as well. Where you do have to put a burden on your INGO partners, give them enough overhead support, not only to be able to do it themselves, but to pass along some of that to their partners, because this is the only way it's gonna open up. But then for yourselves, kind of be creative in how you adopt your own different risk profile. That means, maybe adopting a more proportionate compliance regime for yourself. Do you really need the same amount of assurance from an organization that's accessing $50 million to one, or pounds to one that's accessing 5 million? It's or 2 million. Like, it's a very different equation. And can we operate with a bit more proportionality? And can you lobby your fellow donors to passport due diligence, but go through like anywhere between 10 and 100 due diligence processes a year, paying for all of them? It's a lot of bureaucracy. It's a lot of time. If we start sharing our compliance with each other, sharing those due diligence assessments, we'll have more time to do the business that we want to do. And then finally, for everyone in this room, let's adopt a narrative that working through local organizations is not riskier. It's just unknown. We have been documenting our journey through all of this, and we have yet to find that working with local organizations is any riskier than working with any of our international members. So the narrative is not borne out by evidence. I think we just have to change it for ourselves. Thanks.
Thank you. And 2 minutes, Michael.
I think one of the problems in the system is that about 70% of all the funding in the system goes to the UN. And I think if all the power and money in the system lies in the hands of the UN, then you have a kind of monopolistic system where, the extent that we're going to get reform is in the hands of too few people, and there isn't much incentive on them to promote radical reform, because it's in their vested interest to keep the system as it is, where they get all the money. So I think that what would enable change in the system is if donors gave less than 70% of all their money they had to the UN, and gave much more of it to Troika and the Start Network and the Somali NGO Forum and Goal. And I think if you had a more pluralist distribution of money, you'd get more interesting change.
Thank you very much. I didn't pay him. So I think you'll agree, we've had a great array of thoughts right around equitable partnerships this afternoon, and I really would like to thank our panel, who traveled far and wide with no small hiccups en route. I think it's interesting to look at the word cloud that you have produced, having listened to the panelists, and the word that comes out right and center, in fact bang on center, is trust. And so for all we've talked about in terms of funding, and funding to local partners, and types of funding to UN and from UN to donors, et cetera, trust is the one that rests in the center, and it's probably where we should start and where we should finish. So I'm going to hand back to Jane Ann. I think we will have one final speaker. Would you like us to?
Yes, yeah, you're okay to take a seat if you want. Thank you very much.